Potentially. Here we go.
Okay.
Need a search engine optimization SEO services? Then get in touch with our professional and friendly team to learn more about our range of custom and tailored services designed to suit your exact needs. Every one of our professionals have acquired years of experience, which ensures you get the very best. Our experienced staff is waiting to hear from you and to answer any specific questions that you may have on how we can meet your needs. Just ask for a consultation and let us prove our commitment to you as we promise to maintain the highest level of quality and commitment. Your satisfaction is our prime concern. So please, don't hesitate to get in contact with us and let us show you all the great options we have.
All right, here it is, episode 3 of the Give and Take with Zane Wolfang and
Brother Muggs.
And our buddy Will is here with us in the studio today.
How goes it?
All still loud and clear there, Pat?
Absolutely.
Great. Pat, thanks for having us back for a third week in a row.
Hey, listen, soon we'll be celebrating our 1 year anniversary. There you go.
Hey, that's fantastic. I'm pretty psyched, Brother Muggs, about both of the guests that we have today.
No, we definitely have a good show lined up today.
I think that we're going to start with something we meant to do last week and never got around to, which was more thoroughly introducing ourselves and the sort of concept of the show. And then we're going to talk to our friend Will about sort of a cool skateboard-based protest for Black Lives Matter that took place in Providence recently. And then we're going to have Kristen Langworthy, who works with Common Cause Rhode Island Coalition for the Homeless, and the Voter Access Coalition on for the second half of the show. And we're going to talk a little bit about ballot access with an eye towards the upcoming September primary and November general election. So the Give and Take, as the name suggests, should be, I hope, a lively intellectual discussion about politics. As Pat likes to say, no outrage porn, really trying to cut to the quick, really talk about issues. My name is Zane Wolfang. I'm 27 years old, born and raised in Warren, Rhode Island. I've spent about 5 years on and off now living in the Middle East, 2 years in the occupied West Bank of Palestine in the city of Bethlehem, some time in Jordan, some time in Dubai in the United Arab Emirates. The last 8 months leading up into March 2020, before the COVID pandemic, I was living in Erbil, which is the capital of the autonomous Kurdish region of northern Iraq. And I was working as a journalist out there, and I was working as an ultimate Frisbee coach, or really consultant who was training ultimate Frisbee coaches. So yeah, a lot of time in the Middle East. I'm wearing a shirt right now that says Al Jisr, and this is a great bar in Beit Sahur, Palestine. They have great live music and great ambiance. So always trying to rep something from my travel experience every time I come on here. But yeah, so right now we've been talking a lot about Black Lives Matter, about the politics of the moment, about local politics here in Rhode Island. Eventually, I hope to engage in some discussions on a variety of levels, you know, as local as neighborhoods in Providence, as international, as, you know, the conflict in Israel and Palestine, or some geopolitics in the Middle East. We're going to try and cover a lot of ground and have a lot of interesting guests. And now I'm going to let Brother Muggs maybe give a little backstory about himself as the co-host of the show.
Hello, how's it going, everybody? My name is Brother Muggs, better known as Brother Muggs. And I grew up here in Providence. I'm a Navy veteran and an artist here in the city. I wanted to bring some sort of voice to the Give and Take, to not represent a Black community, but just to have a Black voice here while we discuss these tough issues that have confronted our country over the last, 400 years, but more recently in the last few months, with, more and more people seeing visual lynchings on television. I think it is more important than ever in our independent radio community, in journalism in general, to have a Black voice here for all the people. and hopefully that we can get to these issues and discuss them with the people. So here we are.
Right.
You know.
And I do want to say, that we tend to see Pat at a lot of events. We tend to see Bill Bartholomew at a lot of events, including the Central Falls Public School funding rally, which was
Juneteenth rally.
Juneteenth. He really is at a lot of stuff. But myself and Brother Muggs are also at a lot of events, I have to say. We drove past and took some photos today, Pat, of the empty pedestal where the Christopher Columbus statue once stood. And I think that we're in accordance, or at least Muggs and I are. I'd be a bit interested to hear actually what Will has to say about this, about the removal of the statue being something of a small, if only a token victory, still a small victory for the people. Will?
My name is Will. Born and bred Providence, and skateboarding for about 20 years. Figured I'd mention that since that's the majority of why I'm here. But yeah, I mean, it seems like an important thing happened today, although maybe not as cathartic as everybody had hoped for, and actually taking down the statue themselves. I think that something is certainly lost in the powers that put it up taking it down versus the streets themselves taking it down.
That's a very interesting point. I hadn't really thought, like the emotion or like the rate, like as you said, the catharsis of like tearing the statue down with your own hands as opposed to the powers that be. And then Brother Muggs had mentioned before we came on air, actually, we've been discussing the statue. We just drove past it recently, about like, is the statue really gone, or are they going to put it up somewhere else in the city or somewhere else in the state? And at that point, that would completely, I said at that point, I thought that, there could be a riot, or there could be severe, anger in the community if the statue were put back up. I don't know if that, is the intention, or if the statue is being packed away for good. Pat, I don't know if you have any insight on the current whereabouts or the future of the Columbus statue.
Well, two things. On a humorous note, I kind of have this mental image. If any of you remember the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, when they took that device and they put it in a government warehouse to be probably lost forever.
Yeah.
I think that's an interesting, perhaps, end to this. But I want to point out sort of a dichotomy. The very same folks who are taking to task variety members of the minority community, the community that has found new strength, if you will, in fighting for their cause and their situations and fighting for justice. The same community celebrated about 30 or so years ago the takedown of something called the Berlin Wall. And they celebrated the sheer anarchy of its destruction. They celebrated the physical destruction, and saw that, and rightly so, by the way, as a moment in history.
That meme is making the rounds of the older folks on Facebook, I would say. My parents showed me that one, or my mom, I think, showed me that one. It was for people who are complaining about erasing history with the taking down of statues, but who were quite elated about the fall of the Berlin Wall. I think that's what you're getting at, right, Pat?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
It was a moment of almost global celebration when the Berlin Wall was literally torn down. People have bits of the wall to commemorate the destruction of it, and it was like a joyous event. But
well, I think a part of that joy was certainly the Western media wetting their lips about the onslaught of capitalism that was about to crash, that wave that was about to crash in the Eastern Bloc. I mean, that's obviously a big part of it.
I think that's
there's nothing to be gained monetarily about taking down the Christopher Columbus statue.
Well, I think if there is something to be gained monetarily, I believe it is in the communities that have been disenfranchised by the explosion of, and I'll use the air quotes here, wealth within the last 10 to 15 years. And then, I had an opportunity to have a conversation with a police officer, and recently, and of course, they pointed out that.
I do want to point out that Pat, I don't want to cut you off. Like I do want to hear what the content of the conversation was, but I do think it's important to note, for you or for myself. Like actually, when I drove past the statue today, I noticed the police chief, who I actually exchanged words with during the Night Street standoff at that first protest on the 5th. Verdi, I think his name was. He was cordial enough with me considering the circumstances. But the fact that like a conversation with a police officer can be an opportunity for some people, you know, versus what that encounter is for others. Is it? I don't mean to derail you by picking apart language. That's not my intent. But I don't know. I noticed the wording. I don't know if that is that fair.
No, absolutely.
Then some shrugs in the room. Anyway.
I wanted to hear what he had.
I'm sorry.
Well,
I'm sorry. I just noticed that.
The two I'll call it back and forths I've had with Leo in the last couple of weeks. One of them I actually filmed, and it was a really bad film, but the audio is up there on the Facebook page. You know, and on the Juneteenth celebration, I was taken aback by the what I thought was an alarming state police presence on the Capitol steps. And I went up to him, and again, I always like to point out this as the official middle-aged white guy in independent media. There are things conversations I can have that a lot of other folks can't, because the spectacle of them trying to beat the crap out of me
was quite a thing. There was,
or even really for other just causes, like, you know, for Pride or for the Women's March.
Well, no, for what's it called? During when they did the it was like global warming protest. They sat in the governor's office. Like people got into the governor's office and sat there. You know,
yeah.
People weren't allowed to pass a certain step during this one.
While we have been on the topic of marches, can actually steer us towards what I thought was one of the more unique protests that has happened in Providence in the past couple of weeks, and is actually why we sought out Will for this show. There was what they called like a protest push, or like a skateboard protest in Providence for Black Lives Matter. I saw it through the Instagram page of a local artist who's also a skater who skates with Island Circle. And so I first kind of thought about reaching out to him, but Professor Muggs told me that Will was the guy to talk to about the protest push in Providence. So I'll turn the mic over to him.
Yeah, well, it's something that a lot of skateboard communities have been doing, is like trying to demonstrate solidarity in one way or another. And what we wanted to do here locally, and we, as in myself and a couple other local skateboarders, just to clarify, I'm speaking only as an individual. I'm not like here in any official capacity representing any sort of group. But something that we've been talking about within our group was that although that skateboarding is like a very diverse population, that something that our own subculture has been missing is that the act of skateboarding itself is not anti-racist, although it might appear to be kind of anti-capitalist at times in like how it treats private property and land usage. But in and of itself, skateboarding, the act of it is not anti-racist. So what we wanted to do was we wanted to create an event more or less kind of as a group, as a community, where we could kind of more look inward about how we could improve upon our own biases as a community and as individuals. I think that in the light of our current era, this moment, the depth of the oppression of brown and black people can feel extraordinarily overwhelming. And we wanted to start at the individual level. So what we did is we met at Nutaconkinut Park in Silver Lake, and we had some words, and we had a moment of silence for George Floyd, 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And then we skated from Nutaconkinut all the way across town to what we call a Trinity skate spot next to the theater, Trinity Rep, and the Trinity Brew House.
Can I pause you, Will, just because I think that some Coalition listeners I don't know how frequently people come to Providence, so I'm just gonna let you run with the narrative. But just New Deconkinent is kind of on the edge of Providence and Cranston, right? Silver Lake is Johnston
and Providence.
Johnston and Providence, and actually New Deconkinent has quite a high hill sort of at the back of it if you walk in, and then you can sort of turn north, east, and look over Providence, right? You can kind of look over all of downtown. So, so the skate was decently far, right? Like, did you guys go through like the West End or?
Yeah, we went down Plainfield into Olneyville, and then like kind of hiked up Broadway until it flattens out at the top of Federal Hill, and then skated across Federal Hill, and then down into downtown.
Straight down Broadway, past the Dunk.
Yeah, it was. Google Maps says it was 2.6 miles.
2.6 mile push, and what people wore black, and some people made signs.
Yep.
Was there a police presence?
Until the very end was there a police presence. We made it all the way to downtown without incident, and then a SUV nudged one of the bicycles that had joined our parade. That kind of created a momentary scuffle, which was this like really brief episode where the police showed up, and we thought that I don't know. I was at the back of the line, so I didn't see the whole episode. But essentially, what happened is this woman nudged a bicyclist in his back tire, and she panicked. And we're all flooding the streets on our skateboards to celebrate the fact that skateboarding is now legal on Providence streets after being banned since 1965.
I wanted to ask you to speak about that a little bit as well. I don't know if Pat is aware of that skateboarding law change in Providence, but we're sort of going to circle around to this, that this is not Will's first time, nor the Providence skate community's first time sort of trying to engage themselves or engage their community more with civics. But in any case,
this SUV with Massachusetts plates, there's a scuffle that ensues. They're encouraged to move on. They're panicking. The male passenger is being very belligerent and is threatening to call the police. And we think nothing of it because we're celebrating. We just got to the end of the 2.6 miles. 5 minutes later, 2 police cruisers show up, saying that a phone call had been made saying that a skateboarder had reached into this vehicle and choked the passenger, even though there's all sorts of cell phone footage, saying otherwise. It was a bit of a disturbing reminder about why we were doing it to begin with, because here's this this white couple within a vehicle, and they've called the police, making up an assault allegation with the intent of bringing down state violence on black and brown skateboarders on the streets of Providence. We were able to de-escalate the situation with the PPD. Would you say that the PPD took the lead in de-escalating, or that the skaters took the lead in? Or would you say that both? I think that the PPD at this point is certainly on the back foot. They're well aware of how they're perceived at the moment. And I think as soon as they heard that there's a lot of cell phone footage saying that this alleged assault had never occurred, they were really willing to kind of just let it lie. But it was quite a disturbing reminder, considering we had just made it 2.6 miles to downtown. And then, here's this individual who takes it upon themselves to invent a moment of violence to bring down the violence of the police on a minority individual, and on a group of minority individuals.
I don't want to make you, I don't want to make you have any conjecture. I was just, there was a nudge, there was some literal contact that took place, but I'm almost wondering if there wasn't some anger about the flood of skateboarders and the signs and the disturbance to daily life that was a part of the annoyance, or a part of the motivation to go so far as to not only call. I can understand, in the society that we live in, people get in even a tiny car accident, their car's leased, their car's borrowed, their insurance situation, you call the police because you need it for the insurance claim, right?
Certainly.
But that's very different than claiming that someone reached into your vehicle and choked you, and like bringing police, because you know that the police are coming and they're not only going to see the altercation, they're going to see the backdrop where these individuals in the car perceivingly are outnumbered, right? Because they had an altercation with skaters and there's all these skaters, right? It's almost like they know the optics that the officers will show up to is a scene where it's a crowd of skaters and just the two of them in the car. Like, oh, we're intimidated by the
If you're
skaters.
a middle-aged white couple that's feeling overwhelmed by a situation that you cannot control, you don't call the Providence Police Department and make up a story so the PPD comes down to like deliver us all ice cream. You make up that kind of story.
Yeah, you want some
wanna
sort of
see
reaction
violence inflicted
on behalf
upon
of
people that
yourself.
are less powerful than
Yeah.
you are.
If I could cut in real quick, I was a black skater here in Providence for many years, and I know the culture. And I think mid '90s to early 2000s, the culture was mostly a white kids. White kids were skateboarding. That wasn't really like a thing, in the neighborhood. You didn't see many kids on Camp Street skateboarding. What do you think has changed in the culture to make so many different shades of people come out and show support in such a way? Because the videos I saw of the push off, there was no one demographic there. There was a collective of people all out for the same reasons. But, it was nice to see all those shades of people. What do you think in the culture?
Genders, I would say.
And
Definitely saw some women out there skating. I don't know what I would assume that more men skateboard than women.
Yeah,
overall.
definitely.
So I see like Vans women, and I see like skating seems to be growing in popularity amongst women. But I did see men and women skating, in the push off. Definitely like all shades.
The question was like what's changed in the culture? Like what do you think has changed in the culture?
Like to
bring a collective of people to come together for. I feel like back in '99, 2000, when the Gravity Games was going on, had this had happened, there would have been no push off. There would have been no,
Sure. I don't know. I couldn't say definitively. I mean, as my own experience, it's like I think a lot has a lot to do with visibility, and accessibility is a big part of it. It's the stigma of it is kind of lowering pretty substantially, I think. I don't know. I mean, I'm not really comfortable kind of like guessing at like what makes like a young black or brown man comfortable riding a skateboard, because I have no idea what that experience is like. I mean, I'm a white guy, I grew up on Smith Hill. To me, I would guess that like honestly the hurdles are much higher because it's perceived as like it's like kind of like a fringe activity. I think that if I was like a young black man or young brown man, I would have like or if I was a parent, I know this is real, like I would be very concerned about like my child taking up an activity that potentially exposes them to more interactions with law enforcement. So like, I don't know. I'm really proud of where my community is, and like we've got a long ways to go, but like that's not my story to tell.
Understandable.
I can offer you a quick pivot away from the tough question. Pat, you got a thought?
Absolutely. What I think is equally compelling is, as you've described, the reaction of Mr. and Mrs. Smith from EG or Borington or wherever they were probably from, or the lovely East Side, Grosse Pointe. And I just, as someone who is immersed in talk radio culture in this state, because politically I have to be, and it's part of the milieu that independent media resides in, I will tell you that the local media has created such an incredible climate of fear for people from the burbs going into the city of Providence. And I'm talking about not just the
That's a great local point. Yeah, he said he can't agree with you more.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, I've been away, so I didn't really think of it, but that, Providence is the city, right? Going into the city.
Yeah.
I would say New York City is the city.
I mean, I knew kids from Gloucester whose parents wouldn't let them come into Providence, and it made no sense to me.
Not allowed to go to Providence. I had a friend.
Let me jump in for a second. The next time,
yeah, sorry, we were at the
no, okay. The next time there's a disturbance, and I'll just let that term hang out there. There's a disturbance. Brace yourself and dial WPRO AM 630 and listen, particularly in the morning hours. And you'll
what's that guy's name?
Well, no, he's gone. Now it's Tara Granahan, and good. You will hear the Providence Place Mall. Now, I'm not even talking Manton Ave. I'm not talking Chalkstone. Guys, I probably never told you this. I did over 3,000 lift rides in the south and west end of Providence for about 2 or 3 years while I was doubled up with tuition, and so I know the neighborhood pretty well. And you will hear this the terms. They would have likened what goes on in the Providence Place Mall like the wildings, if you will. I'm dating myself here. That occurred in New York City. The people in the burbs are terrified about the mean streets of Providence. It's bizarre.
Like Providence Place Mall?
Yeah.
Providence Place Mall is a fairly unthreatening.
Understandable, but you gotta understand, like, to them, like, that is the Coliseum of Providence, and so
it's well lit.
Therefore,
I don't get it.
No,
yeah.
Therefore, that's the they feel like things just pop off at the mall. That's all they know. It's the monument of Providence,
But yeah, I would have to agree. In my childhood, growing up in Smith Hill, I mean, if I ever saw a news truck or a news camera, it was either because it was the St. Patrick's Day parade or because there was blood on the sidewalk because a house is burning down. That is the perception of the Pro-Joe, Channel 12, Channel 10, Channel 6. I mean, all local news media has, wholeheartedly, whether, I think that the reporters themselves are doing the best they can, but like editorially, the choices that are made are pretty horrific about what they choose to cover, what they choose to put on air.
Absolutely. No, it's intentional. I mean, understand that, and I know you guys know this, but for purposes of the audience, there are no casual choices. There are no accidents or coincidences in Rhode Island media. It's all about clickbait, and nothing drives clickbait better in Rhode Island than the notion that there's an angry mob just over the other side of Route 10.
Hey, I'm going to jump into this cynical dissection of the Rhode Island media landscape to introduce our next guest, Kristen Langworthy. Hi, Kristen. Can you hear us all?
Hi, Zane. I can. Can you hear me?
Yes. So you should see right now myself and Pat Ford. Is that correct? And
yes,
then
I
also
see you guys.
Hi, Kristen. It's Brother Muggs. How are you?
Brother Muggs.
Good. How are you?
I gotta sign off.
All right, Will. Our first guest is signing off. Will, thank you so much for coming on the show, talking about the push off and about sort of a little bit of the history of the skate community.
Well, thank you for having me. Hope you have me back.
For sure.
Yeah,
buddy.
Really
appreciate it.
All right, peace.
Thanks.
Thanks, fellas. Thanks.
Kristen, welcome to the Give and Take.
Thank you for having me.
So I did preface your appearance on the show with a little bit of information about you, but always best to hear it directly from the source. So maybe you can give us a little bit of an introduction about yourself, and specifically what you're doing in relation to our topic of ballot access and voting.
Absolutely. My name is Kristen Langworthy. I am a former civic educator, and I am now a policy advocate and a person who works alongside a lot of nonprofit organizations to make sure that community members are able to be organized and be aware of what the process looks like so that they can participate more effectively at having their voices heard, regardless of what the policy issue might be. But some of the issues I've worked on closely have been related to good government. And that's one of the issues that is closest to my heart, making sure that people understand how to participate effectively in our democratic system. What brings me here tonight is an initiative that we're calling the Vote Safe RI initiative. and it is to encourage certain changes to be made ahead of our upcoming elections, similar to what we saw in the presidential preference primary, in order to ensure that there is safe and healthy access to the ballot for all Rhode Islanders. We know that structure often limits our ability to do things in a way that might become complicated in conditions like we're experiencing now with COVID-19. And we want to make sure that as we go forward this fall, we have a robust preparation in place to cover those gaps and make sure that people are able to vote.
So, in your mind, like in the short term, with this hashtag #VoteSafeRI campaign, if people search that on like Twitter or Instagram or Facebook, is that where that hashtag is being used primarily? By the way.
Yes, I think social media is a good place to find the hashtag, but to be more particular, one of the primary drivers of this campaign is a group that is known as the Voter Access Coalition. It is something that forms around election time under the stewardship of Common Cause RI, and is primarily about bringing together community stakeholders and organizations that have particular interests in ensuring access to the ballot and democratic processes during elections. This year, we have a particular focus due to the pandemic, as I mentioned before. So the portal for a lot of the information that you might get in detail, if you can't find the hashtag, you could look at Common Cause Rhode Island's website. They have a lot of information that comes from that coalition work on their site nested as well. So that's a good location. Right. That's a trusted source.
There's also, right, like on actionnetwork.org, there's like a specific little portal that you had sent me previously about this Safe and Healthy Voting in 2020 Act, which I did. There's like a form letter, which I believe you could also modify if you want, but I'm not sure. I didn't modify it. But I, put in my name and my zip code and sent a form letter to my representative and my senator. My representative I know personally from I played youth sports with his kid and stuff. But I sent him a form email through the thing about supporting the voter the safe voting access bill, and he sent me a form response right back, which was good. Although it did say sent from my iPhone, so I don't know. But he did say that he supported the bill. In reply to me, which was reassuring until I found out from you that the bill hasn't been introduced yet, and in fact isn't isn't in the legislature enough to really give full-throated support to. So I did feel, no disrespect to my Senator Felag, his answer was very nice. When I found out that he said, yeah, I support this bill. And I found out that the bill wasn't really introduced yet, so his means of support is quite limited at this time. But I did send the email. Long story short, there's this website where you can contact your state legislator that you had sent me previously.
Yes, and I'm happy to speak actually in more detail about that, because it's a good opportunity to kind of have a brief conversation about where we are in this process. So as you mentioned, there is no actual bill that has been introduced to the legislature formally. However, the initiative is backing the hopes that will be introduced when the legislature returns from their current break and will be taken up. So what we are trying to encourage people to do is reach out now to their members of the legislature, their representatives and their senators, and make sure that they are voicing their concerns about access to the election process, and encouraging them to prioritize this when they come back mid-July, to ensure that those steps are taken that are necessary in order to reinforce those processes. So the form that you mentioned will send that message about what the concerns are and what the potential remedies we're suggesting will be. And we want to make sure that when you're speaking to your members, you can also just talk to them, right? There's the form letter, but as you mentioned, you can reach out in other ways. A lot of members are on social media now, and just voicing your concern about how elections are going to be prepared for. We want to make sure that We're not seeing what we see in
So
other
are you
states, like
encouraging people who have just been thinking about this on their own and have some concerns about voting to reach out to their legislators? Is that sort of what you're getting
absolutely.
at? Like to call on the
I
phone
would
and say,
always
like, if you just had a personal worry, like, oh, I live with my parents, I don't want them to get sick, and I don't know how to vote. Like, if people have these concerns, do you think that's valuable for legislators to hear from constituents as well?
I do. I think it's always important to, whenever possible, communicate with the people who represent us in government. I think that they need, and that is our role as the public. It is our role to make sure we are informing them as to what our needs are and what our concerns are. And that's not just limited to any initiative or campaign. That's true all the time. People really should feel comfortable and welcome because these are our public servants. They're elected to represent us, and they can't do their job well if we are not communicating with them about what we need. So any person that has a concern about any issue, but particularly about democratic access in an election year, would very much be encouraged to reach out and communicate those concerns to their members. I think what we're trying to accomplish with this particular letter and this particular initiative is identify specific concerns about access and safety, and making sure that the remedies are pointed out that are best practices in order to respond to that and prepare for it appropriately. So that can be a point of reference for a person to have a conversation with their member, but is not a limitation in any way.
Sorry to interject, Kristen. Could you talk maybe about what you see or what the Voter Access Coalition sees as maybe the one or two like biggest issues or obstacles to access, in the light of the COVID pandemic, and then also maybe the one or two remedies that the coalition is suggesting or lobbying lawmakers to codify for this upcoming election?
Yes, I think that as we all have been experiencing the last several months, the emphasis is on reducing person-to-person contact in order to protect people from transmission of the COVID-19 virus, and especially for folks who are more susceptible or vulnerable to exposure. We want to make sure that nobody has to choose between casting their ballot and protecting their health or the health of their family members or community. And so we want to make sure that reducing person-to-person contact is emphasized. So one example is in the vote by mail process, you would need a signatory of a notary or two witnesses in order to cast a vote by mail ballot. In the presidential preference primary, that was a waived requirement. The governor was able to, under her executive powers, waive that requirement temporarily, but it has not been waived for the fall.
Would the governor be able to do that same thing again without the action of the legislature?
In my personally limited understanding, I believe that is still within her ability under the executive authority that she has during this emergency period. But as is often discussed, people tend to prefer that the legislature take action whenever possible in order to make sure that the intent of the statutes that we have on the books are respected. If necessary, I think it would be appropriate for the governor to take that action. And that is my opinion. And I think that's an opinion that's shared by others. But it is important to recognize that we have a separation of powers in our government that is slightly unique amongst other states, and that we need to be mindful of that in terms of how we proceed in making changes to how we conduct business of the government. And that is just one example of reducing person-to-person contact.
Right, that's true. And I know, like, I've read some of the stuff that you've sent me, so I know actually, and even on the information portal about the Safe and Healthy Voting in 2020 Act, there are a few other points as well. 24-hour ballot drop-off boxes for early voting, yes. Right? So people can drop off their ballot without coming in contact with people.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Go ahead. No, please do.
What I was saying was, the Board of Elections was very effective at moving to place drop boxes in various communities across the state for the presidential preference primary. But because of the time constraints, we were coming down to the wire at the June point, and we needed to act very quickly. So one of the things that we want to emphasize now is how important it is to prepare further in advance, whenever possible, to get a head start, and that helps you respond more effectively. So getting those drop boxes back out into the communities so that there's a way for people to drop off an application for a mail ballot, drop off their mail ballot itself in a secure box that they feel confident about, but also to ensure that folks are able to reduce how often or how much they're going to rely on the in-person on election day voting method. We want to ensure that there's choices, because there are going to be people for whom voting in person on election day is not only important, but necessary in many cases. So it is not about choosing one method over another for everyone. It's about adding options to people that enable those who need to vote by mail, for example, that option, those who need to vote in person on election day, that option, and as well as an in-person early voting period is one of the other things that is mentioned in our initiative. A 20-day, or at least as much as possible ahead of the election period, where people could vote at their local board of canvassers office in person, much like they would on election day, but not by mail. This would be a very important way to reduce, not eliminate, but reduce
like
the number of people that
going
are
to the
at
post
the
office,
election
right? Like
on
going
the
to the town, just go in and drop your ballot off sort of throughout your day. Yeah, and I think you put that really well, like that you phrased that, you know, sort of this paradigm shift of like, what's a democratizing choice, or like what's a democratizing structure in America? Is it like this sort of democracy rules ram through one choice and make everybody do that? You know, everybody gets a scoop of vanilla, right? Or is it democratizing choice, like presenting an array of options, you know, diverse options to fit the needs of a diverse citizenry? I thought that was, you know, sort of you phrased that paradigm shift quite well. I did see Pat, I thought, react when you were talking about the ballot boxes. But I don't know. I know Pat is the head of the Libertarian Party, so I don't know if the boxes are too big government.
No, not at all. I just wanted to reflect on my experience with Access this week. It actually had nothing to do with the actual election process, but the actual process of getting candidates petitioned. And I just thought it was intriguing because I did get into it with Gina Raimondo at her press conference 2 days ago.
Nice.
Voices were raised, eyebrows were furled, but ultimately, the state's failure to eliminate petitioning requirements in the age of COVID, I believe, prevents grassroots efforts from getting people on ballots. And the notion that we would have to ignore the government's social distancing dictates, which have been numerous and repetitive, in order to fulfill a bureaucratic process, was astonishingly short-sighted. I got into it at the BOE meeting the week before. And by the way, say hi to Mr. Marion for me. He's I consider him a pal, someone I admire greatly. But I was just wondering, and I'm not trying to put you on the spot per se, but your reaction to candidates having to go out and petition in person.
I think that your concerns are valid, honestly. And this is my personal opinion. I wouldn't want to speak for others at this point, but I think that there's a general consensus that when our government is encouraging us to follow the advice of medical health professionals to remain in the socially distant practices, that it makes no sense to me to not waive certain requirements that are a burden or an obstacle for people conducting signature collection safely. And in my personal opinion, I think that there's an attachment to the way things are usually done that can be kind of an obstacle to us changing and adapting to, honestly, a changing landscape. When we're in the midst of a health crisis, we need to make sure that we are taking that as our top priority. And to your other point, I think that there is a significant lack of access to folks who are not already on the insider track of the political world. So there is definitely space in the conversation for both the practical concerns of our current health crisis, as well as a wider point about how do we ensure that folks are able to access the ballot. And just as a personal aside as well, it's not just the candidates that have trouble accessing that process. It's also a concern for everyday residents and voters.
Right.
If you would
Absolutely.
like to support a candidate who's not already been running for office before, and you want to give someone the chance at that ballot access, you have to now choose between your personal safety or the safety of the community and this requirement that signatures be collected in a particular manner. So I do
Exactly.
think that the judge in the case earlier this week, and I think again today, the ruling is sound, encouraging an alternative means of collecting those signatures. But I think that there's room in the conversation that goes forward. I wouldn't want to speak too much on that side of things since it's not my area of expertise. More the other elements of our conversation today.
Well, just one last
Can I
thought.
rewind this?
I think why it
Can I
pertains to.
rewind this back for a second
Sure.
to the presidential primary? The whole conversation. I know that we're very focused today sort of about the September 8th primary and the November 3rd general, and that's sort of what the Safe and Healthy Voting Act is about ensuring access for this immediate short term. But I do think that there's a conversation that needs to be had. And I do think that our Secretary of State, Nellie Gorbea, who's a woman who I certainly admire, I had the opportunity to volunteer on her campaign staff for a short while when she first ran for Secretary of State. And I've always thought she was a great lady. So I think that she is very open to modernizing our sort of voter registration and voting procedure. But I do think that is a serious conversation that needs to happen. In the presidential primary, I was living in Iraq. And I ended up registering as a Democrat. I'm traditionally an independent, so like I'll affiliate to vote in primaries, which in Rhode Island, the competitive primaries tend to be Democratic primaries. And then I disaffiliate on the way out. Well, I was in Iraq, so I had to do something different. Our mail system and like this requirement of a notary and the signatures and the way, or like you have to drop off your mail ballot application at the Board of Canvassers. How? That's why I need a mail ballot. I don't live here. That makes no sense to me, right? And what I'm really getting at is I ended up voting in this Democrats Abroad primary. The candidate that I preferred won, picked up 9 delegates for the convention. I think Rhode Island has 21 or 22. So I threw my vote into a more liberally predisposed crowd with less delegates at play, but just to ensure that my vote actually counted, because Rhode Island's system is so archaic that in this modern and globalized world, which, by the way, the U.S. empire controls, our citizens still can't even vote from the countries that we imperialize. And my buddy from Montana voted by PDF. His state emailed him his ballot, and he voted, and he emailed it back, and he was done.
So I will say, to your point, I think innovation is something that I have seen personally from the Secretary's office on multiple occasions, and I would applaud her for modernizing systems, but also taking a measured approach and making sure that, when we're talking about innovation with relation to something as core to our democracy as our elections, I think a cautious but optimistic approach is appropriate. So wherever possible, we want to examine what are best practices, what are the vulnerabilities to those things that might undermine or strengthen how we have a relationship with our democratic process. But to your greater point, the vote by mail system is still a little outdated, but the use of a vote by mail process is not something that's particularly common for us here in Rhode Island. People have always had that option to vote by mail, but it's been more limited in the past. It's only recently that we were able to select an option to vote by mail solely on the basis that we do not think we will be able to make it to our polling place on election day. And that is something that I would encourage. People are able to apply for their mail ballot now. So you can actually go on. Sir, go ahead.
Sorry, Kristen. Can Brother
Kristen,
Muggs ask you a question?
Yeah, I have a question for you, Kristen.
Absolutely, go for it.
At a lot of these briefings with the governor, she has a representative from the Department of Health present with her to answer questions in case people have direct questions about, what is healthy, what is not, and she will put forth someone from the Department of Health to answer some of these questions. Is there someone within the Department of Health who reflects some of the opinions that you've shared with us tonight that your organization would be able to refer to for
Yes, I believe that there was someone from the Department of Health. I believe McDonald was a contributor to the candidate signature ballot access suit that the ACLU brought, and that is what we were discussing earlier. And I do believe that their guidance was part of our process at coming up with the suggestions for how to proceed going forward. There's also just the more general point that there are folks with other conditions or constraints like having a disability, being homeless, for example, or housing insecure, that also shades into this as well. It's not solely a health concern. It's also a general access concern as well. But I take your point that we want to make sure that the guidance that we're bringing to the table is coming from health experts because they are the best equipped to explain the consequences or ramifications for certain practices when we're talking about, especially the person-to-person contact during the pandemic. I hope I answered at least part of your question.
Absolutely. No, I think more than just, answer questions, for the negative aspects of it, they could help to support some of the reasons that voter access needs to be, there needs to be more
efforts
put into it,
Yeah. I was
one of the reasons why I was here.
Go ahead.
Oh, sure. Go ahead, Zane.
I was saying, I didn't mean to harp on the mail system because I know you're trying to expand access to the mail system. But like for me, what's frustrating, like I think we should expand mail voting. Like I think even if we get digital access to voting, there should still be mail voting. I know, like my grandmother writes down instructions, number 1, number 2, number 3 in pencil on a notebook for procedures on the computer, like 1, open Google Chrome, 2, type the URL, right? She would send her ballot in by the mail. While we get the newest, iPhone 15, like my grandma will still be sending.
I did. I sent in an absentee ballot when I was
exactly what I was
when you were
deployed to, yes.
Yeah. But it's like
I think that's incredibly important point.
People are doing it on the computer. So it's not like impossible for Rhode Island to conceive of a world where this happens because it does, right? Yeah. We just don't do it. And it does, I think there is a big culture in this state of like, my dad calls it like the comfortable rut in Rhode Island. Like you just do what you do because you've always done it that way.
And I would say that while that is a good observation, it's also important to recognize that dispositionally taking a more conservative approach to change makes it so that we don't inadvertently cause unexpected consequences. So when we do make changes, we want to make sure that those changes are taking into consideration how they will impact different people in different ways. So to your point about computers, there are always going to be folks who either cannot or do not have the ability to utilize technology in the same way that you or I might. And so that no matter what we do to expand in the future, the way we do voting in our state and in our country, we want to always be mindful of the ways that will impact people who may not have, say, an internet connection or a printer to print out something or a computer to type on or an email account. These are things that you want to keep in mind because sometimes in our zeal to make change, we overlook sometimes the consequences, inadvertent consequences that can come out of that as well.
Right. And digitizing
if I could jump in for a second.
Yeah, go ahead, Pat. I was going to say how the Iowa debacle for the Democratic Party, sort of speaks to that point. But anyway, go ahead, Pat.
First of all, I just want to congratulate Kristen on her efforts, but I want to just plant a seed, if you will, for the next challenge. As important as voting is, it's equally important, and this will sound like Captain Obvious here, who you're able to vote for. The problem in Rhode Island, I feel, while voter access is important, the next step for the minority-majority community in this state is to actually promote its own candidates. And the way the system is structured, if you are not going through or attempting to vote or support for the two elitist parties in the state, the Democratic and the Republican Party, then you are effectively disenfranchised. And the reason I say that is because Rhode Island has one of the 2 or 3 most difficult ballot access laws in the nation. And this is something I specialize in, Kristen, because I'm chairman of a third party. And so what's happening across this state as we speak is that folks who are not part of the Democratic Republican Party, which, by the way, are taxpayer supported, even though they're private organizations, are disenfranchised from grassroots efforts to put their candidates on the ballot. So what I would posit as to plant a seed is, how do we get access for a variety of political candidates from around the state to the ballot and to equal status in the party system, all right, with the establishment parties? Because ultimately, I believe the future for the political movement of the Southwest and North End of Providence, the majority community, is going to be candidates from their own organizations who are pursuing support for their communities.
Right. Although I would say like candidates from Providence don't always like become huge hits with the community, or like, I mean, I'm not from here. Angel Tavares and Jorge Alorza are from Providence and went to Providence Public Schools, if I'm not mistaken.
Understand? Yeah, and I don't think that they have the that popular image that you're talking about. But someone like John Gonzalez, who just won the council seat for Ward 1, like I would say he's as close to a political celebrity as we've gotten on the East Side in a long time. You know what I mean?
Did he, forgive me for being unfamiliar, did he unseat an incumbent, or?
They had an election for.
Race, I believe he was uncontested after the primary. Or in the primary, excuse me.
Uncontested in the primary. But he may have a general. Well, if he's a Democrat, he won't have a serious general challenger.
If I'm not mistaken, I believe it was a special election for the ward seat in the Providence City Council, and that he's already been seated. So I believe that has been finalized since the primary.
Yeah.
Cool. Sorry, I know we all interrupted. Pat asked Kristen a question, and myself and Brother Marks both stepped in. But Pat was asking about getting more candidates from the community to represent the community in
right.
the state.
So I think,
but the important point is not being tied to have to submit, if you will, to and Mr. Gonzalez. I mean, I followed his campaign very closely, and he ran a wonderful campaign. I mean, really a very professional campaign. But ultimately, if you are from the neighborhoods, the only access you have right now to advance yourself politically on a practical level is the two major parties. And the two major parties, it can be argued succinctly, are huge failures for folks in the communities that are challenged by not only just COVID, but economic, schools, every important issue at the time. So how do we eliminate the barriers to entry for candidates and stop this, I believe, in obscene reliance on the Democratic and Republican parties?
I would say that one of the things I've always emphasized myself in as a civics educator, but also as a community advocate, is that empowering the community members themselves to be more aware of what the processes and requirements are and how to navigate them is a good first step at making sure that when there's a candidate, regardless of their affiliation or non-affiliation, that has the support and trust of communities, that they are able to galvanize those supporters in the community and meet whatever requirements there may be in order to get that support translated into a political action. I understand where you're coming from, Pat. I would say that political waters being muddy at times is no real barrier if we have a more informed and empowered electorate comparatively. I wouldn't want to minimize what you're saying, but I do think that we lack an empowered electorate as much as we have structures that make it difficult for candidates of no significant major parties affiliation to get access on their own. So door knocking is one way that candidates can reach out to potential voters and make contact. But I know that many voters report not being contacted by a candidate or campaign. And that's one of the reasons why we have such a low voter turnout rate, is that people are unaware of the options for them to participate and support a candidate.
Can I speak on that for a second, Kristen? Just because that's really interesting. So my first political experience in the state of Rhode Island was volunteering for Laura Piscaturo's campaign in District 12 or 14, I don't know, in like Governor Francis area over in Warwick. And Laura and her partner are both wonderful. And it was, Cicilline had been elected, and gay marriage was just about to be legalized. There and openly married female partners. There was like a big surge. McCaffrey hadn't been challenged in like 12 years. He was the majority leader of the House, maybe. And what was really interesting about that campaign, which Laura ended up losing by a pretty narrow margin, was that all of the campaigns, or all of the Democratic candidates, are provided with voter rolls for like the last 5 years, right? That show everyone in the neighborhood if they've ever engaged with the political process. And they have software to track it. And it's like whether you registered Democrat or Republican, like which primaries you voted in, if you voted in primaries, right? So when you look at the volunteers that you have available to you and the geographical range of canvassing that you're able to do in the time span that you have, even in a small state of Rhode Island, people just skip houses of people who are disengaged with the process. Like, it is a vicious cycle. Like, you don't waste your time knocking on the doors of people who don't vote, and they never vote. And that's like the common sense, or like the conventional wisdom of the ground game in Rhode Island politics, as I understand it.
If I can answer Pat's question, I think you need a grassroots movement that is focused on an unaffiliated, forefront. And
would you say like pragmatists, like focus on like pragmatic?
Yeah, just say and if you have some sort of grassroots movement, we have all these tools nowadays. We have Instagram, we have Twitter, we have all these things where door knocking is no longer a necessity.
Yes and no, right? We have Instagram, we have Twitter, right? But 10,000 go out to the protests on Friday, like the biggest civil rights moment in history. 2 weeks later, 15,000 go to the state beaches. So people don't show up. Go ahead, Pat.
Can I tell you something, guys? First of all, you're talking to someone who's run a political organization in this state for now 6 going on 7 years. Here's the reality. While social media is certainly a critical part of any campaign, and I clearly am knee-deep in social media, that's why we're all here tonight. Ultimately, the way state law is structured, that if you, for example, if you live in Dominic Ruggiero's district, you are not going to be allowed to run for political office as a Democrat unless Dominic Ruggiero allows you to be. So as a result, then where does someone who's from the majority community
we were talking about earlier today
go to? And the reality is that the laws in this state are so calcified by the Democratic majority, and to a degree also enabled by the Republican minority, all right, that they have created such barriers to entry, all right, to the political process to run for office, that it's virtually impossible. And I know this because we've run people for a number of years. We've gotten people in the 30 to 40% range, but the reality is, all right, is that the politicians in this state have erected walls that allow only the 2 principal parties. And until organizations step up against that, then the gatekeepers are going to be the very elite that your protests, my protests, our protests are fighting against. It's all rigged. And the reason it's rigged is because that when you become a recognized political party in this state, right, you are subject to all sorts of advantages in terms of ballot access. The state pays for your primaries. And the only way to become a political party in the state, to be recognized by that, is to get 5% of the presidential vote or 5% of the gubernatorial vote. Sounds like it should happen, right? Well, that's actually we are the second worst state in the nation for that. So the very politicians who run this state that we despise, I'll just keep it clean, that we have differences with, creative differences with, are the very same folks who are working aggressively to keep people from the minority community off the ballot and therefore away from political power in order to affect change, unless, of course, they are approved to go through the Democratic or Republican Party by the very gatekeepers that we oppose. And that, in a nutshell, is the real problem in this state.
All right, I'm going to bring us full circle, Pat. In the cogs of that vicious machine, the sort of transitive interaction that I've been focusing on is like taking protest energy and turning that into voters on the rolls. I know that, the reason Kristen approached me initially and, why we've continued to collaborate is that she's, much deeper into this work than I am and, is focused, on sort of like all the way from civics education and civics literacy before we get people on the rolls to afterwards transforming that next step, transporting potential voters on the rolls into informed members of the electorate. And so, Kristen, maybe we can have you on again next week. If not then definitely in the near future. But thank you so much for joining us.
I would be very happy to keep you guys updated and come back. And just as a last plug, I want to encourage your audience members, maybe 2 things that they can take away from our conversation about the Vote Safe RI initiative. One is to reach out to your state reps and senators and tell them to prioritize protecting the vote. You can reach out to the governor and the Secretary of State's office as well to communicate that as in their own ways they can influence this process. And then the second thing is to make sure that they're verifying that they're registered voters. And if they would like to vote by mail in the upcoming elections, those applications are available online. You do not have to wait for one to be sent to you. If you have the ability and the interest, you can download it, print it out, fill it out, and mail it in yourself as we speak. So I definitely encourage folks to do that if that is their intention, and to otherwise continue to practice the social distancing and use masks and generally be considerate of others and kind to one another as we go into a very contentious season, I would say is important to know.
It was great to meet you,
All right,
Kristen.
Thank you so much.
Very much for having me.
No, thank you very much, Kristen. We appreciate you.
And Pat, of course, we
I
appreciate you. Coalition Network listeners, we appreciate you.
Thank you, everybody.
Pat, where do we get the show, the backlog episodes? CoalitionRadioNetwork.com.
Yeah, but by this weekend, all the shows will be up on CoalitionRadioNetwork.com. We've created a special space for the show, and folks will be able to watch at will. And we're going to put the tonight's show into repeat. So particularly since Kristen was on, we're going to put this into repeat, and you'll see this pop up every day for the next couple of days.
I thank you guys very much for having me.
YouTube, Facebook, Pat, anywhere else we can?
Yeah, no, absolutely. It'll be on Facebook.com/The Coalition Radio, and I want to talk to you guys offline really quickly about a couple of ideas that we can do.
All right, secret chats to come. Give and take, listeners. Thank you very much, Kristen. Thank you very much, Will, who already left us. When he comes back and watches, thank you, Will, very much. Shout out to Will. All right.
Good night,
Pat,
folks.
Are we staying on here?
Yeah, hang on a second.